Thank you so much, Penny. I'm so excited to kick us off tonight. My name is Julia Broussard. I'm the Interim Assistant Provost for Title IX here at Tulane. I oversee Tulane's efforts around Title IX. I'll explain more in a minute what Title IX exactly is. And I'm excited to be joined by Erica Woodley, our Dean of Students, and Chris Zacharda, our Director of Student Conduct. They both lead a lot of our response efforts here at Tulane, and so you'll hear from them in a little bit. And then I'm also excited to be joined by Alicia Czachowski, our Director for Public Health Initiatives and Assessment, and Jennifer Hunt, the Assistant Director for Sexual Violence Prevention. They lead a lot of our prevention work here on campus, and so you'll also get an opportunity to hear from them. And so to just give you all an outline of what we're going to be talking about tonight, as I said, I'm going to give you all an overview of what is Title IX and how it influences how we respond to sexual violence here at Tulane. And then Erica and Chris are going to give you all a deeper dive into how do we actually respond to incidents of sexual violence, what happens when we learn about an incident or get a report. Jennifer and Alicia are going to talk with you about Tulane's all-in prevention plan. And then I'll come back just briefly at the end to let you know about our Sexual Misconduct Climate Survey that's launching this week. And we will definitely save some time for Q&A at the end. Feel free to use that Q&A function that's available to you on Zoom, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. But so to get started, Title IX is a law that was passed in 1972. And this is the entire law up on the screen here. It's not one of these laws that takes pages and pages and would require hours to read through. The law itself is this one sentence. And you'll see in here, it's saying that essentially we can't discriminate on the basis of sex. That's the language that's in the law. And so you might be wondering, how did we get from sex discrimination to Title IX also covering things like sexual assault? And so my predecessor, Meredith Smith, came up with this visual that I really like for understanding this. So we have our overarching umbrella of sex discrimination. Tulane can't discriminate on the basis of sex. And you can probably easily think of some examples of what that sex discrimination could look like. So we can't say, we're going to give all the female students priority in choosing their housing over all the male students, or my office is going to hire student workers, but we're going to pay the male students more just because they're male. But we've also had court decisions and guidance from the federal government that's established that sexual harassment is a form of sex discrimination and that sexual violence is a form of sexual harassment. So all of that fits under that umbrella of Title IX. And I'm going to break these terms down a little more. So sexual harassment is any unwelcome behavior of a sexual nature. This could be something verbal, something written, something physical, something visual. And with sexual harassment in particular, when we're talking to our community, we really encourage folks to report stuff when it's at a low level. So maybe a one-time comment to someone that's sexual in nature and is unwelcome isn't going to necessarily rise to the level of violating our policy, but it's certainly an opportunity where if they report that to the university, we can take steps to intervene and hopefully nip that behavior in the bud until it does become a really ongoing pattern of behavior. Also covered under sexual harassment is gender-based harassment. And in particular, just last year, there was a Supreme Court decision that affirmed that harassment and discrimination on the basis of someone's gender identity or gender expression or sexual orientation is a form of sex discrimination that's covered under Title IX and similar laws. And so the federal government reaffirmed for us that Title IX does protect folks who are experiencing harassment or discrimination on the basis of those identities as well. And then under that umbrella of sexual violence, we have sexual assault, which we are defining as any kind of non-consensual sexual contact. We've got, oops, sorry, my arrows stopped working. Intimate partner violence, which is acts of violence or threats of violence between two people who've been in some sort of romantic or intimate relationship. Sexual exploitation, which may be a term that you're not immediately familiar with. It's kind of the newest addition to our policy. And it's a catch-all for a lot of different behaviors that involve the exploitation of someone else's sexuality. But most commonly, the way we see this play out at Tulane is non-consensual recording or filming or taking images of someone else, in a sexual state, or sharing those images or photos without someone else's permission. So most commonly we see this as a student may consensually share, for example, nude images with a partner, but they don't give permission for that partner to then go and share it with their friends, right? So if they start sharing that photo with their friends, that would be a violation of our policies in sexual exploitation. Or a student may be engaging in a consensual sexual act with someone, but they didn't give that person permission to film that act, and that person then films it and shares it with other people. And then finally, we have stalking, and this is a pattern of behavior directed at someone that would cause them either to fear for their safety or suffer really substantial emotional distress. And kind of like sexual harassment, stalking often involves a pattern of behavior, and so we encourage our students and folks in the community. You don't need to necessarily get hung up really with anything we're talking about, but especially with things that involve a pattern like sexual harassment or stalking. You don't need to get hung up on, does this rise to the level of violating a policy? You can always come to us to receive resources, and then there's always steps we can take to try to stop that behavior without necessarily maybe having to go through a formal process. And we'll talk more in a minute about what some of those steps look like. And so with all these behaviors that I'm talking about, really essentially Tulanes obligations are when someone comes to us and says, hey, I think I'm a victim of stalking or I was sexually assaulted. One, we want to ensure campus safety. And first and foremost in that is certainly making sure that any victims or complainants are safe. But sometimes there's a broader campus safety piece we need to look at. So for example, if we had a student who came to us and said, my ex-partner threatened to come to class and shoot me, right, first and foremost, I'm concerned for that victim's safety, but then there's also a larger campus safety issue there that we need to attend to if there might be someone coming to campus with a gun to shoot someone in a crowded classroom. And then on the other side, the other obligation we have is we need to provide support to impacted parties. And again, first and foremost, we're going to look at providing support to the victim or any complainants or reporting folks, but sometimes there's also other folks in our community who need to be offered support. So it's not uncommon for a victim to have disclosed to friends who are also feeling really distressed by the situation, or maybe friends have been witnessing some of this behavior and we need to offer support to them as well. We also do offer support to respondents, which is the term that we use for students who've been accused of misconduct. What that support looks like, their needs may be different than a victim who, we're doing, for example, safety planning with them or something to that extent. But basically any parties who are kind of involved in the incident, we're going to offer support to them. And Erica and Chris are going to go more in depth in a minute about what that looks like. But before I turn it over to them, I did want to talk with y'all just briefly about some of the changes that universities have had to implement in the past couple years around Title IX. So in 2020, the Trump administration's Department of Education released new Title IX regulations that govern how we implement Title IX on campus and how we respond to a lot of incidents of sexual misconduct. One significant change was that they limited the scope of Title IX. So previously at Tulane and at most universities, kind of anything that fell under that umbrella of Title IX that I talked about, any act of sexual violence, intimate partner violence, stalking, sexual harassment, if a student came to us and said they've been a victim of that, or a student within our community was accused of engaging in those behaviors, we generally process that under Title IX. It didn't matter if they said it happened in my residence hall versus it happened while I was on spring break in Florida with some fellow students. The new regulations put a geographic limit on our jurisdiction. So now only cases that occur on campus are in some very specific off-campus locations, like for example, a fraternity house, fall under Title IX. That doesn't mean that we no longer respond to incidents that occur off campus, right? We still have a process for responding to a report that someone's partner was physically abusive to them off campus. But it no longer falls under Title IX. We would address that under our broader policies here at Tulane. The other limitation is that they narrowed the definition of sexual harassment. So it's a bit of a higher bar now to call something sexual harassment under Title IX. Another major change for us is that these cases that do meet this new definition of Title IX, so for example, if we have a sexual assault that occurs on campus and checks the boxes for being under Title IX jurisdiction, we are now required to go to a live hearing with cross-examination conducted by the students' advisors. And the students can pick whoever they want their advisor to be, but in most cases, they're going to be attorneys. This is a real departure from the process that we had previously set up before. I think a lot of us feel like this isn't necessarily the most student-centered process. We felt like the process we had before was a good, fair process where all students had an opportunity to be heard, but it wasn't as adversarial as this live hearing with cross-examination is. And Erica and Chris may want to add more there because their office has been implementing this, but this has been a challenge for us. Another change in the regulations is that it does allow us to use informal resolution under certain circumstances. Previously, we had been strongly discouraged from using certain types of informal resolutions. I actually think this is a positive that the door is more open for us to implement things like restorative justice that our community has been having more and more of a conversation about a need for here on campus. And another good piece, I think, is that the regulations really affirmed the right of victims to receive support from the university, regardless of whether they want to file a formal complaint and go through a formal investigation and resolution process. Another challenge for us that I don't have up here on the slide, but I just want to mention really quickly too, is that the regulations really made clear to us that we can't take punitive action with a student unless we have a formal complaint and we go through a formal investigation and resolution process. And so sometimes we'll have students say to us, I've heard that so-and-so sexually assaulted a friend of mine, why are they still here at Tulane? And there could be a variety of reasons, but one of them may be, we haven't had anyone come forward and file a formal complaint about that person or go through a formal process with them. And so the university is going to be limited in what steps they can take with them. And so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Erica and Chris. And Erica, if you want to chime in any more on the Title IX regulations, please feel free to, because I know you'll have a lot of experience there.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would say, hi everyone, I think the thing that I would say about the Title IX regulations is that unfortunately, this has become something that's very politicized. And so, part of what we work with and what we sort of struggle against is the kind of ever-changing nature of these regulations. And so, everyone was prepared for the Biden administration to reverse some of these things and to move us back to kind of an Obama era regulation style. That hasn't happened yet, but I anticipate that's coming. And I think, I think that will be the sort of norm until we can settle on something that's sort of in the middle of these things. And I think that's what we've tried to do is interpret this as sort of moderately as we can. But this is a little different also. Past guidance has been just guidance. And this is a little more than that. We're actually required to follow these things. And so we couldn't, even as a private institution, say, you know what, we think live hearings are counter to what we're trying to do. We're not going to do those. We can't do that. So we're actually bound by these things. And so I think Julia went through this stuff, but I think it's important as parents for you all to understand that this is a very dynamic landscape and it changes a lot. And, we have Julia who spends the majority of her time trying to keep up with what's happening, on this front and making sure that we're compliant and that we're doing, that we're compliant and that we're also doing what we think is in the best interest of our students within that kind of framework. Chris, do you want to add anything?
The practicality that we've seen as well is that has significantly increased the number of students that are interested in an informal resolution, and we've seen a significant decrease in students that want to go forward with the formal investigation. And so those numbers have been pretty stark.
Yeah, so we'll go ahead and start talking about the process, Julia, if you want to go to the next slide. Yep. So I think the way that most cases start out for us is that, we get some kind of disclosure at the university. And we've done a lot of education with our community to make sure that folks know what to do if that comes to them. The majority of people on campus aren't trained in responding and supporting survivors of sexual assault. We hope everyone has kind of a base level of knowing what to do, but we really want to get them to the right folks. So sometimes that comes and then, students may disclose something to a faculty member. We may get an online report. We have folks who report directly to us. Sometimes they go to the police. Sometimes they're seeking medical care and we get kind of looped in that way. There are a number of ways that people come to us. Sometimes friends report for their friends that something's happened. And so as soon as a disclosure is received, the student who is the victim in the case is assigned a case manager. And we have an office called Case Management and Victim Support Services. And those folks will reach out to the student right away and, encourage them to come in for a meeting just to sort of make sure that they have the right kind of support. This isn't something that we would mandate. It's up to the student. The level of support in kind of everything we do is really the student dictates it. And so if we meet with a student one time and they say, I'm good, I don't want to see you anymore, we let that be okay. We make sure that they know that they can always come back if they need support at any point. And there are certain situations where we would probably check in with them again, particularly if they're going through the conduct process, but it's really student driven. And so Julia says in the slide, the student can choose to respond. There are certain situations where I would say, we want to at least have some kind of contact because we want to make sure the student is okay. Once they tell us that they're okay, again, they can say, I don't ever want to see your face again. But often they don't do that. They want to engage and they want the support that comes with having a case manager. It can be anything from, I missed a class or I missed an exam because I was at the hospital. Anything like that. They can help with academic accommodations. They can help them get connected to clinical services. They can help them get connected and understand the conduct processes. If they're going through the criminal process, they can walk them through that. They really, depending upon what the student is doing, they can make sure that the student gets whatever they need. And they've had all of the folks in conduct and in case management have done trauma-informed training. So they're all approaching this from the lens of, this person may have experienced some kind of trauma. And sorry, one more thing. We do talk through a lot of resources that are available on campus, but for a number of reasons, students have different levels of comfort with on-campus resources versus off-campus resources. So we really feel strongly that it's important that students understand what's available through us and what we can connect them with in the community. All right. So any student who comes to us can get supportive measures. And these are things that make the student feel safe. So sometimes, let's say they were assaulted by someone who lives on their floor. We can move them off the floor immediately. Like we can secure some kind of alternative living situation for them as soon as they say the word. I mentioned the academic accommodations. Let me back up to the housing thing. One thing we can't do. So if I'm a student who's meeting with someone as a victim, and I say, I live on the floor with this person. I'm not interested in the conduct process, but I'd like you to move this person off my floor. We can't do that. There are due process concerns with that kind of move. And so, we would immediately offer the impacted student the ability to move if they wanted to. But if they wanted, the person moved, we actually have to engage in a formal process. We can help with academic assistance and accommodations. We can talk to professors, help with extensions or retakes of tests. We proctor exams for students, sort of help them get back on track academically. We do medical and counseling referrals, connections, follow up. Some students if a student has goes in and has a sexual assault exam, sometimes they get on medications that are really difficult. And so we can help them kind of navigate all that. If they're planning to go through the criminal process or also within our process, we do, Title IX is the only area in which students are allowed to have attorneys as advisors. And so if they choose, they can have an advisor of their choice. Many choose attorneys. And so, if we have a student who says, I want that, but I can't afford it, we actually help them secure that kind of advising. And if they're pursuing something off campus, we also can help them get connected to representation off campus, or to work with the district attorney's office and be kind of a liaison with them. And the assistance with the reporting process, this is a big one, because they may meet with someone in the Office of Conduct and then need to go back and process what Chris tells them, and they want someone just to sort of talk through it with. I know parents all want to know if their student is going through something like this, and we encourage students to reach out to their support system, because this is it's very difficult. We want them to have as much support as they can. We don't do that. So you're never going to get a call from us that says, hey, your student was sexually assaulted, or hey, your student was accused of sexual assault. We encourage them to do that, because we know that it's difficult and we want them to have the maximum amount of support, but we're not going to do that. And then, the kind of support that case managers provide, we have students who work with us for, just the time that they're going through the process. We have students who don't even work with us that long. And then we have students who work with us for the entire duration of their time at Tulane. I will say, I sort of said some of that through the victim lens, but we also do, and I mentioned, if a student's been accused of sexual misconduct, if they're still part of our community, and it's a very difficult thing to be accused of sexual assault or rape. And so if someone's going through our process, they also are assigned a case manager for what we call respondent support. And it's basically some of the same stuff. It's someone who's working with them to make sure that they understand all the processes and that they have the right kind of representation and the right kind of resources and support to get through it. Again, I would be lying if I said this is something that people, that it doesn't have a lasting impact on people, even just going through the process. It does. And I would also say, I should have said this earlier, but this is a problem on our campus, sexual assault, and it's a problem on every college campus in the country. If you're ever hearing from someone in any of the roles on this call who isn't saying this is something that we're struggling with or that we're working on daily, you're not getting the full picture. Because it is something that is, every university in the country is dealing with this issue in a major way. Chris, you want to talk about the investigations?
So then when a victim comes forward, the connection is made with a case manager and myself. And so as the director of student conduct, I will meet with that victim and walk that individual through a variety of different options that they have if they want the university to take any action. And so in that procedural review meeting, and sometimes parents sit in on that, sometimes, again, as Erica had shared, sometimes attorneys or other advisors may join the student in that meeting. And so we've been doing those either in person or over Zoom. And in that meeting, I walked through the two main university responses that we can take. So the action that we could take could either be an informal process in which there's no punitive record that's part of the student's educational record, but there may be some developmental, there may be some educational, there may be some restorative expectations that the respondent, the individual that's being accused, is required to complete. And so the victim and I work through creating this alternative resolution and this plan of action by which I manage the completion of all of those requirements at the request of the victim that the respondent is required to complete. So that's our informal process. And again, we have a lot of latitude.
Of that, Chris? Will you give them some examples of like what the informal process might include?
So some of those may include things like requiring the respondent to go through some consent workshops. And so we have a variety of consent workshops with our partners in the Well that we've been working with, that students may go through some online courses. Or another example is we've had students that complete anger management courses. Or if we have reason to believe that there is some sort of substance use or substance misuse concern, we might have individuals that are engaged in a substance use or misuse assessment and then are required to comply with a treatment plan if we have reason to believe that there is an abuse or misuse concern. There may be elements of reflection. There may be elements of restoration that could include community service, where we have had victims that wanted some sort of letter of reflection or letter of acknowledgement, acknowledging the pain that they've caused. And so we have a variety of different options. And that is the beauty of this informal resolution, is we're not wedded to one specific format. We have a lot of variety in terms of what is the victim seeking for that victim to feel at peace and to gain some closure in resolving this trauma that he, she, or they have been through. So that's our informal process. The formal process is outlined in our Code of Student Conduct in great detail. And as Julia had shared, the branch of that formal investigation process is going to be dictated about whether it falls under the Title IX umbrella or not. For us, all of our sexual misconduct allegations fall under some sort of major matter investigation. If it falls under the Title IX specific narrow requirements, then that kind of investigation does end with a live in-person hearing where there is cross-examination of all parties by the opposing individual's advisor. For those instances that are still sexual misconduct that we might say are Title IX adjacent, but that happen off campus or that don't meet the definitions outlined in Title IX, there is still a major matter investigation process, but with those, there is not a live hearing. And so once that process has begun, that formal process has begun, I meet with all parties involved, the victim, who now becomes the complainant, as well as the respondent, with their advisors, walk through what that process is going to be, and then the case gets turned over to an investigator. And so then those investigators are trained on Title IX regulations, on Violence Against Women Act regulations, other Clery training regulations, trauma-informed care, as Erica had shared. And so all of those trained investigators, some work for the university in the Office of Student Conduct, some of them are contracted as outside investigators. Those investigators then execute the investigation. They interview the victim, the complainant, they interview the respondent, they take statements from those individuals, they collect any evidence, whether that be medical evidence, photographic, or screenshots of text messages or social media posts, medical records if they are relevant and warranted. And then ultimately that investigator packages that into an investigative summary that all parties and their advisors get to review. After that investigation summary is completed, for those non-Title IX major matter investigations, that adjudicator will then make a determination of responsible or not responsible. And if there is a finding of responsibility, then sanctions are attached. And sanctions are attached based on a variety of factors, most notably the wishes of the victim. The impact statement that the victim is able to submit certainly impacts the sanctions. A student's prior history impacts the sanctions. The severity and totality of the case, the disruption to the community or to individuals, all of those are taken into consideration for sanctioning. For the Title IX process, the investigation is the same, but instead of the investigator also being the adjudicator, it gets turned over to that independent, separate second individual. That individual presides over the live hearing, and then ultimately, after all of the information is collected, will then make a determination. Again, is the respondent responsible or not responsible? Regardless of which path, which formal investigation path we take, all parties are also, they have options through our appeal process as well. And so those appeal options are also outlined in our code. And I review from start to finish, from report all the way through resolution, conclusion of an appeal. I walk through that entire process with both students or with all students involved and their advisors.
Thank you so much, Erica and Chris. I'm going to transition now to Jennifer. I'm sorry. Before I do that, really quick, we just have a slide up here summarizing some of the resources on campus. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I just wanted to have that because I know Penny sends out the materials afterwards. And so you'll have a summary here of a lot of those resources. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer and Alicia to give y'all an overview of some of our prevention work on campus.
Thanks, Julia. So this first slide really kind of talks about the goals of the all-in plan. These were developed after the last time we did a sexual misconduct survey through actually many of the people on this call tonight, along with several other people from different departments around campus, to try and come together to really put together a good comprehensive plan to work toward creating a safer campus where we could prevent sexual violence. So I'm not going to read all of these to you, but these were the goals that we set up. And as Julia may talk about later, the plan is for once we do this next survey is to come back together as a team, look at the updated data, and then see, do we need to update these goals? And if so, how? Next slide. So one of the big goals and projects that was clear from the data and from talking to students was they didn't always know where to go or how to get information around either sexual violence prevention or response. So we created a website that was kind of the central hub for all of the information around sexual violence prevention and response. So students can come here and find this page, look at it, and they can get information on what programs are happening on campus, what student groups are available that they could potentially become part of to work on efforts around sexual violence prevention and response on campus. What to do if they are a victim or if one of their friends is a victim, and how to get that person to the resources they need, how to report, more information on what Title IX is, and going over a lot of what Julie went over at the very beginning of this webinar, and just trying to keep it all in one spot so that if a student needed this information, they could come here and not have to click around to a bunch of different websites. So this has been up and running for about 3 years almost at this point, and gets great usage from our students. It's updated regularly so that they're able to get the most updated information about what's going on campus. Oh, there's also information on there for parents. Sorry, Julia. And then one of the other things that we heard loud and clear was that people wanted the ability to get more involved in the prevention work happening on campus. So there was really a big plan to kind of create a bunch of different groups to allow more individuals to get involved in this work. So we have the Tulane Coalition to Stop Sexual Violence. This is a group of staff, faculty, and students that get together a few times a semester to do professional development, to talk about what's going on campus, to talk through how to work together and create either additional programming or different ways of getting information out to not just students, but also to employees and community members. Our sexual violence prevention implementation work group is that group of individuals that comes together that looks at all the data from not just the climate survey that will be happening, but other data that we collect on campus. So things through student conduct, the police department, campus health, to try to determine, what are the needs of our students and our employees. And then lastly, the All-In Student Coalition is just what it says. It is the very specific student coalition that people can join that are interested in getting involved in this work. They don't have to be necessarily involved in another group working on sexual violence on this campus. A lot of them are, but it's a way for them to get involved. And a lot of what this group does is actually work on our Sexual Assault Awareness Month programming, as well as works on with student groups who are interested in doing sexual violence prevention work. And they've created a grant program that student groups can apply for. And then this coalition works with them to make those programs happen. And at this point, I believe I'm going to turn it over to Jennifer.
Good evening, Tulane parents. My name is Jennifer Hunt. I am Assistant Director with the Well for Health Promotion. And my primary role at Tulane is I really help to oversee and coordinate the sexual violence prevention and sexual health education programs that we have at Tulane. I also advise our student advocates, SAFEs, who work in sexual violence response work. But basically the idea behind sexual violence prevention is we really want to prevent sexual violence before it happens by giving people the skills, behaviors, knowledge, social norms that they really need to make healthy, consensual decisions rather than abusive or negative decisions when it comes to sex and sexuality. So we put a couple of program highlights up that we just wanted to kind of note. And as I'm not going to list them for you, but I just kind of wanted to highlight a couple of aspects of these new initiatives. One, I want to note that we determined the sexual violence prevention programming that we do both from internal data that Tulane collects, like some of the sources that we've been talking about. We also look to external, national, international, and professional organizations like LAFASA and RAIN, who all work within sexual violence prevention. But we also pay really close attention to the anecdotal feedback that we get from students, the feedback that we're hearing in student conduct situations and Title IX situations, to make sure that we're directly responding to the specific concerns and experiences that our students have around sexual violence and sexual harassment. And the other thing I want to note is how kind of cross-collaborative these programming initiatives are. So you'll notice we've got guides and programs for parents so that parents can get involved and have a part in these conversations. We have programs for undergraduates and graduate students, as well as staff and faculty trainings and programs. And so we're really trying to make sure that the entire Tulane community knows what kind of information and programs are available to try to prevent sexual violence. And to prevent sexual violence, what we're really trying to do is give students skills around communication, consent, healthy boundaries, relationships, asserting oneself, saying no, hearing no. So these are really the kind of dominant skills that we are talking about in all of these initiatives. And so some exciting ones that I'll just note is that realizing that a lot of our students enter into college without a lot of education around consent, boundaries, healthy relationships, communication skills. We developed a pre-matriculation online curriculum that all incoming students, as well as sophomores, receive before they even arrive on campus, to start developing some of those skills and behaviors in our students, and also setting expectations for how we expect them to treat each other once that they're on campus, and what the consequences of not following those expectations are. And we also have a new sophomore reading project, because we really realize that our underclassmen are where we see some of those concentrations of experiences of sexual violence. So we're making sure that we're touching our underclassmen as well as our upperclassmen, but our underclassmen multiple times throughout the spring and fall semesters in their first 2 years, so that they're really getting a lot of support and education around sexual violence prevention, but also support and response if they do experience sexual violence during their time here. So these are some of our newer initiatives and our updated initiatives, but we also wanted to highlight some of the things that we do annually. So if you could flip to the next slide, Julia, these are programs that are happen every single year. Our students anticipate them. They know that they're coming. Our faculty and staff anticipate these programs and integrate them into their curriculum and their kind of extra credit opportunities. And again, we are trying to make sure that students are consistently hearing positive social norms around healthy relationships, healthy sexuality, and consensual interactions. And these are the programs that we do this through. So we have Shifting the Paradigm, which is a large program that we do every fall. We have Shifting the Narrative, which really focuses on the experience of BIPOC survivors that happens each spring, as well as kind of awareness weeks and months throughout the year that we have about 2 or 3 each semester that students are getting a lot of programming all at once, as well as continuing to scaffold those messages throughout programs and social media and newsletters and things like that throughout the year. I did just want to kind of highlight that these are some of the programs that we see, and note that this by no means is all of what we're doing when it comes to sexual violence prevention, but this is just a nice overview, and you can check in to the All In website regularly to see what events are happening or what new initiatives are going on. Thank you, Julia.
Great, and I'm just going to very quickly give you all a little info about the climate survey that's coming up before we answer some of the questions y'all have been sending in. So this Friday, every single student will get an email asking them to take our campus-wide sexual misconduct climate survey. And this is a survey that is seeking to really measure and get a picture of what do our rates of victimization look like on campus. So what percentage of our students since enrolling at Tulane have experienced sexual assault, stalking, intimate partner violence, sexual harassment. We're also collecting some other demographic information so that we can look at, are there maybe certain groups that are experiencing higher rates than other factors like maybe alcohol usage that are correlated to these rates that might suggest places where we can do some targeted intervention. We'll also be measuring, do students understand where to go and report on campus or where to get support and help? If they did utilize some of those resources on campus, did they have a good experience with them or find them helpful? And then also checking some knowledge of, do they have an understanding of consent? Are they engaging in bystander intervention? And as folks have been mentioning, this is really going to inform then, do we need to make changes to how we do response or prevention on campus? And then we'll also be able to benchmark with our 2017 survey. And so just some quick nuts and bolts, as I mentioned, your students are going to get a link to complete the survey. It'll take them about 25 minutes, but they'll have an opportunity to get some incentives for doing that. And then we're going to use those survey results along with other data and also just what we've been seeing as practitioners on this campus over the past few years to update that all-in prevention plan with the goal of in spring 2023, sharing with the community the climate survey results along with an updated prevention plan. And so with that, I ask that y'all as parents, if you can just remind your students to take the survey or maybe talk with them about the importance of the survey. It's incredibly helpful for us. And then our contact info is up here and we can start tackling some questions. And Jennifer, I'm actually going to give the first one to you. Someone asked what the SAFE program is. And so I would, as a former SAFE advisor, I would love for you to talk about that group and the great work they do.
I would be delighted. Our SAFEs are an incredibly passionate and determined group of undergraduate students who undergo 40 hours of initial training and 20 plus hours of annual training to become peer advocates for survivors of sexual violence. So they go through a wide variety of training, everything from what is active listening, how do you develop empathy skills, to crisis intervention, to what does a referral look like? How do you make a referral? What resources are available on campus? And so they go through all of that training so that they can run a 24/7 hotline. They also do in-person support at events and also do workshops, educational workshops throughout the semester. But their main service is they run a 24/7 peer hotline for survivors of sexual violence. So any Tulane student that needs just somebody to talk to, somebody to help them navigate maybe some of the resource options that are available to them, talk through who they could potentially reach out to at the Tulane community or in the New Orleans community for support. They're really there as kind of a first stop to give some initial support, to be a good listening ear, and to also refer students to long-term support or any university services that they might need access to. But we have about 70, we actually have 70 SAFEs currently. We just had our 70th member come back active, and they recruit in the springtime and they train in the spring. So they recruit in the fall, they train in the spring. And so we are about to train up a new group of advocates this weekend. So after this weekend, we'll have 40 new fully trained SAFEs.
Hey, Jennifer, do you want to talk also about the difference? You made me think of this, the difference between reporting to someone who is a confidential resource versus, just a private.
Absolutely. So we have two different types of resources on campus. We have confidential resources and we have private resources. The vast majority of people on Tulane's campus that would fall under this are private resources, and I'll explain the difference. Confidential resources are resources that if you disclose an incident of sexual violence to them, they cannot disclose your private information, the information that you've told to them, without written and explicit permission from you. And so on Tulane's campus, there's only a few sources of confidential resources: Campus Health, the Counseling Center, and then SAFEs, who are also kind of employed and fall under Campus Health, which is why they maintain that confidentiality. On the other side, there's private resources. And while private resources will respect privacy and try to ensure that people's personal information is kept private, they do share certain types of information with other university resources so that students can be outreached. So what that looks like in most cases is a student discloses to a Tulane employee or RA, the student employee that they feel trust with. And that student employee or that Tulane employee then explains, okay, thank you so much for telling me. I'm now going to make a care connection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give some really basic information to case management and victim support services so they can outreach you and give you the option of if you would like to talk more and learn about resources. So private resources must make that care connection. They have to make sure that that student receives at least an outreach from CMVSS and can decide if they want to go from there. A confidential resource actually cannot, just like a doctor or a counselor, they cannot disclose that information except for those really rare instances of an imminent threat to your life or someone else's. So that's the difference between private and confidential. And as you can see, we've got a couple of confidential sources on campus, but the vast majority are going to be private resources that we have.
Yeah, and on that note too, I would just add with the private resources, we're kind of sharing information with one another on a need to know basis. So case management's, updating conduct. Hey, we've had a report from a victim, y'all are going to want to reach out as well to offer to speak with them about their conduct option. My office is getting pinged so that we can kind of keep an eye on cases and make sure, basically, like Erica was saying earlier, we're compliant, that we're offering victims and other parties the support that they're entitled to. We're offering respondents the support they're entitled to, and that our conduct process or any other actions we take are following the laws, but also fitting in with our values and expectations here at Tulane. Couple other questions. Chris, while you were talking about the conduct process, I think this question came up while you were talking about informal resolution. Someone asked, but if like a respondent is going through an informal resolution process and they're admitting to wrongdoing, why wouldn't they be kicked out of school? Like, why are we taking remedial measures or other informal measures with them?
And I will say many times they do. We would remove that individual from the institution. But as I said, that one of the guiding factors is what are the wishes of the victim? And so if the victim very specifically says, I don't want this person kicked off campus, then we will take that into consideration when we're making our determination about whether that individual should be removed from campus, either for a finite period or for indefinitely. And the other thing that I will also say is the number of times that a respondent has acknowledged or admitted wrongdoing is pretty low. That doesn't happen very frequently.
I would also just like underscore, even in the formal process, oftentimes we have, victims who know the person that they're accusing of sexual assault, and they have very strong feelings about not wanting the person's life to be ruined, or not wanting, in spite of what they've been through. And like Chris mentioned, we really try to listen to that. But I think, people on the outside of our processes don't always know that, there are a large number of people who go through our process on the victim side or on the complainant side who don't want their person to be removed from the community. They want them to learn and understand what they did was wrong and not do it again.
And then the only other thing that I'll add is, and again, we're required by the Department of Education that if we are involuntarily separating someone from the university, we have to have a process that is rooted in due process, in that sort of fairness. So we cannot arbitrarily just say, well, we have a report, so you're out.
Yeah, thank y'all. Another question we got was someone asking, and this is a really good question, but one with no easy answer. Why is it, that despite all of the efforts we're making here at Tulane, students are getting information before they come to campus, they're getting information when they come to campus, there's other educational programs and events they're being exposed to out of the year, that we're still seeing so many cases of sexual assault? Like, why aren't students understanding what sexual assault is and then choosing not to engage in that behavior? And I will start with a couple of thoughts, but I suspect that my colleagues also have some thoughts here because this is a complex issue. Research on why people commit sexual assault, there's a lot of factors that go into that. And there's also a lot of different kind of profiles out there. So we don't have just kind of one profile of a rapist. I think there are some people definitely, I've seen this in the research and from personal experience, who know they're doing wrong and kind of don't care that they're doing wrong. But a lot of our cases fall into a camp where, I don't think the student, I'm not trying to make excuses for someone, but they don't fully recognize the harm that their behavior caused. And if you haven't read the book Sexual Citizens by Jennifer Hirsch and Seamus Khan, I highly recommend it. It's an incredible read if you are interested in campus sexual violence. And I think it would be especially interesting as a parent. It really gets into how a lot of sexual assault on college campuses is fueled by not recognizing basically another person's humanity and citizenship when it comes to sex, that students are motivated by thinking about what are my sexual needs and wants, and maybe this pressure to feel like, well, I've got to, have sex with someone at any cost because that's what people do, and not stopping to fully recognize, how does the other person feel about what's happening right now? Not stopping to pause and go, how should I be interpreting this person's silence? Is that consent? And so I think my colleagues, Jennifer and Alicia and the folks over at the Well and Chelsea Hill, who also works with them, have been doing some incredible work to try to build that skill for our students so that they're better understanding how to interact with one another sexually and do that in a way that respects someone else's sexual citizenship. Anyone want to add to that?
I would love to add to it, because I think that this is, that question really kind of is a question to my own heart, because I understand how it seems like such a simple thing. But one of the reasons why we've really leaned into giving students positive education and examples of sexuality and relationships is because what we found is a lot of times the adults and the influences in young people's world assume that there's a certain amount of education and information flow happening. That's just not. Some of our students come from really intentional and comprehensive sex education and healthy relationship education background, but some of our students are coming from educational settings where they're not being talked to about sex or sexual health in any way. Maybe their parents aren't speaking to them, the adults in their life aren't speaking to them. And so in the absence of any real reputable sources of information, they're kind of going to what's available, which might be what's on the internet or what's on television, which we kind of probably can all agree has a lot of examples of really unhealthy and abusive dynamics in it. So what we're finding is the majority of US students have less than 11 hours of relationship or sex education when they arrive at US colleges. And most of those hours are really based on like STI prevention and pregnancy prevention. So our students are arriving, and some of them really have never been taught what a consensual interaction is, or how coercion and communication work, or what are the characteristics or warning signs of unhealthy or abusive relationships. They just have never been taught that. So I do think some of this is that we really need to invest in our young people's knowledge around what they should expect out of relationships and what they should bring to relationships, so that we're giving them the tools before they even arrive on college campuses to start participating in those healthy interactions. But I think a lot of times we're assuming they're getting this information, but we don't really know from where. We couldn't really name the source that we expect them to get it from.
I also do think the other thing that is, a huge issue in again, colleges across the country, not just Tulane, but something we struggle with is the use of substances, the overuse and the misuse of substances. We have students who are responding to, functioning as respondents, and they don't even remember what actions they took, and so I think sometimes that stuff is not conscious. Now, that doesn't mitigate it or make it okay or mean that they're not going to be held responsible for it, but it is, when you look at alcohol, both as a drug used to facilitate sexual assault, but also as something that impairs people's judgment, we have to really work on our collective community's sort of approach at substance use. We need them to, and part of this is developmentally where they are trying to figure out their boundaries and all of that. And they should have a safe place to do that. But I think we would be remiss to not acknowledge that alcohol plays a role here.
Yeah, thank you all for all that great input. I knew y'all would have additional thoughts because it's such a complex question, but a really important one to look at. I think our last question for the night, someone asked, has the institution seen an increase in incidents and reporting during the pandemic? And that's actually a really interesting question. We do an annual event every year called Shifting the Paradigm, where we share our reporting data from the past year, past academic year. So we do it from July 1 to June 30th. And the pandemic has had some interesting impacts on reporting. As best we can tell, what's happening is that anytime we're kind of locked down or the students aren't here on campus together, our reporting rates go down pretty significantly. And what we suspect is that's reflecting an actual drop in incidents. So in March, April, May, June, July, August of 2020, when our students were all, I think for the most part at home, locked down with you all, they didn't really have many opportunities to, engage in behavior like sexual assault or intimate partner violence, or even to a lesser extent, stalking and sexual harassment, because a lot of that requires you to be in person with another individual, and they just weren't having those opportunities. We did wonder if we would see a rise in cyber stalking or sexual harassment digitally, but we didn't necessarily see that. And so I think the biggest impact we've seen is that during times when we're under stricter COVID restrictions and there's less opportunity for human interaction, we're seeing fewer incidents happen. Erica and Chris, would y'all have anything to add to that?
I do have something to add to that, and it gets to Jennifer's point about our students not really understanding the dynamics that are involved in romantic or sexual relationships before the pandemic. I think what I feel like happened a bit is, and I even feel this way, and I'm a 44-year-old woman. I think when you are pulled away from social interaction for a bit, when you come back to it, you're a little rusty and things aren't, so we've had a lot. We haven't seen an increase in terms of sexual misconduct, but we have seen an increase in terms of like interpersonal differences. People not communicating what they want or how they feel, and being really like having some really sticky situations around that. And I think, at the core of a lot of the kind of things we see is a real misunderstanding of what your partner's looking for and what you're looking for. And so it makes me nervous as we sort of move into a place where we're kind of reopened. And I think it's important, if you're a parent, to have a conversation with your student about that, and about just kind of how they approach those sort of things.
Penny, does that wrap us up for the evening, or do we have time for any more questions?
There's just one other question about the resources that define proper sexual etiquette and examples, narratives of what's appropriate or inappropriate. So perhaps Jennifer, you could give just a couple of more specific examples of what some of your educational programming contains.
Absolutely. So before students even step onto campus, they go through about 3 to 5 hours of online modules. And those aren't just things that you click through. They're interactive units that my colleague and I, Chelsea Hill, built from the ground up with the help of many of the people in this room, that really focus on very basic skills: sex communication, how to say no, how to receive a no, some of the ideas that we've heard, like, you shouldn't communicate during sex. What are characteristics of healthy and unhealthy relationships? So they're going through a pretty intense kind of social norming around healthy relationships and healthy sexuality before they step foot. At orientation, on the first night of orientation, they go through a workshop with our peer educators that's focused completely, it's called the consent conversation, and it's really focused on what is a consensual interaction, what does a non-consensual interaction look like, how does intoxication and incapacitation fall into the kind of sexual power dynamics. And then we also have resources that are always available to students through our campus health website. Students can also request access to our online modules at any time. And then we do programming throughout the year. So actually in 2 weeks is our third annual Sex Week, which is a week of programming that's really focused on skill building and social norming around healthy relationships. And again, a lot of this stuff kind of sounds like it's about sex and it's about pleasure and things like that. But what we're really doing is kind of hiding the broccoli and the brownies for students. So we're saying, come in and do this workshop about sex. And the entire workshop is really about like talking to your partner, communicating, hearing a no. What does a nonverbal no look like? What should you do if you're unsure with what your partner is saying? And so a lot of times we have these workshops that are kind of have sexy names and look exciting, but we're really trying to integrate sexual violence prevention into those programs. And the last thing I'll say, and then I'll stop talking, is we do have a guide for parents. It's available on the All In website, but I would be also happy to send it to Penny and make sure that Penny can send it out to anybody that registered. That's called Joining the Conversation, Talking to Your Student About Sex and Sexuality. And it's really just a way of kind of having those small conversations, even kind of exploring what consent looks in non-sexual situations, like petting somebody's dog or, walking into somebody's home, and really getting parents prompts on how to talk to their students about it, or books or movies that they can watch together to start those conversations. So I'll make sure that Penny has that and can share that with anybody that accesses the webinar as well.
Yes, it's also posted, I believe, on the parent program's website with this information and some resources, but I'll include those links again. And I think it's very useful. There's a lot of good examples and practical ways to approach it, and some pop culture references to kind of help you ease your way into the conversation with something that's not so threatening or doesn't, come across in an odd way, but gives you an easy way in. So we'll wrap up now. We are very grateful to all of you who were interested and available tonight to participate in this education and conversation. And we know this is important to you and it's important to all of us here. So we thank you for participating. I'd like to thank all of the panelists as well. And just remind the parents that in a couple of days, I'll send you those links to the recording of this, a PDF of the slides, so you can review that too if you want without the video, and some links to those resources, the All In website and the conversation starters and everything. So thank you, everyone. We appreciate you very much. If you have any feedback that you'd like to offer about this, you can email that to parents@tulane.edu, and I'll share it with the panelists. If you have suggestions for other webinar topics, you can also email that to the same email address, parents@tulane.edu. Thanks a lot and good evening.